Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry my voice is, I'm losing my voice. I hope I can make an introduction. So I'm going to make a very short summary of our two distinguished guests. First, welcome to Technico. I know many of you just came to see two brilliant women who are going to give us the honor of doing a Technico Distinguished Lecture today, which is sponsored by the Department of Engineering Informatics, the Computer Science Department here at Technico, and also the two research institutes, INESC and LARCIS, and also by CMU Portugal, which I'm also here representing as co-director of the program. It's again my honor and privilege to present two colleagues and dear friends, taking advantage that they came here to Lisbon to give a joint lecture. I think this is the first time they are together giving a lecture. They are very important people in the area of HCI, and they are very good examples because they are two women that are leading two of the leading research groups and departments in the world in the area of HCI. And none of them is a computer scientist by training, so that's even more outstanding. So Professor Yvonne Rogers is professor at University of College London. She directs UCLIC, which is the UCL Interaction Center. Her background is in psychology, and many of you probably studied HCI from her textbook, which is one of the most important textbooks for the HCI. And Professor Jodi Forlizi is the director of the HCI Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. She's originally a designer. I believe I heard from our friend Dan Sworiak that they had to create a PhD for Jodi because it didn't exist by the time she applied to do a PhD at Carnegie Mellon. So this also says a lot about how special these two women that I'm very pleased to introduce today. So without further ado, I will pass on to Yvonne and then Jodi, and then we'll have a panel also chaired by Anna Paiva, our professor.
Thank you very much, Nuno, for that nice introduction. If you look on my Wikipedia page, I am both a psychologist and a computer scientist. I think the best people are those who are neither one or the other, but they're interdisciplinary. So whilst my undergraduate degree was in psychology, I also then went into computer science. I also did design, a bit of anthropology, and even a bit of philosophy. So I think HCI is really about bringing together different disciplines and having that mind that can think beyond just a single discipline. Okay, I'm just... Sorry about this, usual technology problem. There we go. Just needed someone else's magical touch. Our two lectures are called Beyond User-Centered Design, and I'm going to focus on what's happening currently by thinking about beyond graphical user interfaces and the next generation of voice user interactions. And most of you will be very familiar and you will have been brought up on graphical user interfaces. In the last few years, we've had the advent of voice user interfaces, in particular via these smart speakers. And I understand that the Portuguese version is only in the last year come out. So I'm going to just, for those of you who haven't got an Alexa, just play this video. It's 5 years since Alexa first came along. How time flies.
Let's get this party started.
Alexa, tell me a joke.
How does NASA organize a party? They plan it.
Alexa, what's in figgy pudding?
What is photosynthesis?
Photosynthesis is a process.
Alexa.
Open garage door.
Turn on front door.
Okay.
Alexa, open Rock Out Loud.
Yay! Let's rock out loud.
Alexa, you have math skills.
I tried.
Alexa, turn on the Christmas tree.
I'll leave it at that, but you can see how Alexa has been used in the home for a diversity of uses and quite creative ones. Currently, there are 200 million of them have been sold worldwide. And if you look at this graph, you can see how smart speakers are poised to even overtake tablets by 2021 in terms of the number of units sold, and also wearables are on the rise, whereas GUI-based technology is flattening out, and I believe laptops are also on the decline. So this, makes us, as researchers, think about what is it about voice user interfaces. And they've become very popular for a number of uses. And we saw in the video how they're supporting families playing games, telling jokes, controlling devices like opening their garage, turning the Christmas lights on, and so on. And it can also, through that encourage new kinds of social and emotional bonding. And I will talk a bit about some of the research that we've done later about this. It can provide extended radio functions, so it might, suggest to you what you might like to listen, and also reminders for the elderly about their routines and what to do. And research has been done to show how they can, provide these services. But essentially, the use of voice up until now has been largely command-based. It's like saying, Alexa, do this for me, do that, do that. And my lecture is going to be thinking about, is there more that voice user interfaces can do besides, us just commanding them? And, also at the end, thinking about, will they overtake or augment graphical user interfaces? So let's just, for a quick minute, go back to looking at the properties of graphical user interfaces. They've been the staple UX since the 80s, whether it's a PC, a mobile device, laptop, a tablet, tabletop, smart boards, smartphones, smartwatches, and then probably this year we'll have smart rings that even have GUIs on them. And the core components, as we know, are WIMPs, windows, icons, menus, and a pointing device. And there are many different kinds of these menus and icons and so on. And I'm not going to go through an introductory 101 lecture on this, but it's something that we just take for granted now. And some of the core actions that we do using these GUI interfaces, click, drag, and drop. And this is Tableau, which is a very popular database data analytics tool, and you can see here you just drag items into a menu, which then results in some action, and then you can drag and drop. And this is something that we just do, and it's very effective for many tasks. So why would we want to use voice when we can do many of our tasks? And I think this is a question we need to consider, especially since even though machine learning has improved considerably the algorithms for recognizing voice, there still are many cases where it doesn't recognize very well. And here's one cartoon here, which I use in our book, and it still holds today. So to think a bit about, well, what role are smart speakers playing at home and work? And I want to start by thinking about how they differ from other voice assistants, which have been designed for individual use. So Siri and so on, which you've had on your mobile phones for many years, are designed for you as an individual. Whereas these smart speakers, they're placed in the home, in the kitchen or in the living room. And the form factor for of one of these smart speakers is agnostic as to who uses it. It's a bit like the toaster. If you like, anyone can use it, and you can use it as a personal device when alone, but it can also be used as a shared device when together, so it can be used to mediate family interactions. And what we're finding is it's becoming a new member of families. It sits in the corner, or it sits in the middle of the table, and takes, and can be used to help with homework. And it's being promoted amongst business applications to be able to coordinate meetings. So here you can see where the red arrow is, that's an echo there. And the idea here is it will make reminders or record what's being said and take minutes. So it's taking on a role in business meetings to make them more efficient. The actions that are largely adopted using these smart speakers is to give a command, to listen and then respond. And that's quite different from what I said about GUIs. And so what we've been doing in our research is to think about how these affordances of smart speakers and the way in which they've been used in the home and workplace are different, but also how might we think about them not as voice assistants, but as collaborators, and they can be machines that we can work with. And as I've shown you, the voice assistants are currently largely reactive. They react to us, but what would it take to make them more proactive so that they could collaborate with us as teams or in families? And in particular, to think about the role they might play in helping groups interact. Would they play the role of being a moderator, a facilitator, or an instructor? And how would you model these? And then when and how should they intervene in human conversations? And there's been quite a lot of research in human-robotic interaction looking at some of these questions. But I think with smart speakers, they provided a different form factor by which to think of the role that they can play. So our research has been looking at how we can turn these devices or virtual assistants into virtual collaborators. And in particular, we need to ask some fundamental questions. Firstly, how do we understand the context in which these conversations take place? We don't want to have a speaker there that keeps interrupting when you're having a meeting and saying inappropriate things. We certainly don't want to have a clippy. For those of you who can remember, Microsoft introduced its first virtual agent I think it's about 20 years ago now, which would pop up every time you try to do something like write a letter, and would say, I see you're wanting to write a letter, would you like a template? And this was really annoying to the user, and so Clippy didn't last very long and was confined to the dustbin. But now we can think differently about how virtual agents can play a role in this kind of collaborative or team setting. But we need to make sure that we don't design them so they're always interrupting, or they get in the way, or they disturb someone when they're thinking. And then there's another big question, which is, should we design them to be human-like? By this I mean, should they sound like humans, or should they sound like robots? Should we add what are called speech disfluencies? And these are things like we say, when we're following someone in a conversation to show that we're listening. And should these virtual assistants also do that so that people feel that they're listening to you and taking heed? And these are questions I think that we need to do research to answer. So the project that we've been working on in the last 6 months is called the Voice Viz project. And we're particularly keen to be able to encourage more people to talk in groups. I don't know whether your experience of when you're working in a team or a group, it's not that everyone participates, it is that some people participate more than others, and some people don't participate at all. And so there's an inequality in the contribution. And one of the things that I've been looking at over for many years is how can we enable technology to encourage more people to take part and to stop people who are talking too much to talk less. This is a project that we're running with Great Ormond Street Hospital, which is in London, and it's a children's hospital. And we're particularly interested in teams of clinicians who are being given lots and lots of data now that's being collected about patients, about the hospital, but they don't really know how to interpret it or how to analyze it. And they don't have time themselves to spend becoming data analysts. So our research is to try and not just give them more GUI interfaces where they could use filters to look at the data and the system would suggest to them that what the data is showing, but to develop what we're calling slow interaction. We want people to slow down and think a bit more, to reflect on what they're looking at and what they're interacting with in order to maybe come up with suggestions or inferences or making sense. And we want them to externalize their thoughts by way of speaking. And the reason we want to do this is we think that it can help with more creative exploration of ideas and also to think about the data in different ways and see new connections. So our system that we're building isn't just a voice interface, but it's a voice interface that combines with graphical user interface. We think the best way forward is to think about how you combine rather than thinking about one or the other. And here we see a team of clinicians working in the hospital looking at data. The data that we've been using in our research is obesity data. And it's data that's over the last 30 years. Obesity is becoming a huge problem worldwide. And we're looking at, and the clinicians are getting more data from different sources, from the global south, from developed countries, about children and about adults. And yet it can be quite hard for them to think about what does this mean? Are there trends? Why are there trends? And so that's why we use this data in this context. So, we thought about how we might put an agent into our system that could make suggestions to teams when they're trying to make sense of this data. And rather than doing a top-down natural language processing approach, we've looked at how we might analyze conversations to identify opportune moments by which our agent would intervene in their conversations. So looking at metalinguistic features, silences, if nothing's been said, and for how long, what the pace of the speech is, who's talking, is it animated, the number of questions asked, and also body movements and head movements. And we've developed our agent called Visi, and Visi can make suggestions based on this modeling at opportune times. And these are the kinds of things that Visi might suggest, which is, do you need a hint for analyzing X? What do you think of this? Shall we move on? Did you consider the difference between variable X and Y? And so on. And you can see that these are more prompts probing the team or the people to think about what to do rather than telling them what to do. And we think that's really important, is to try and just sort of nudge them or scaffold them when they may be stuck, rather than sort of telling them what they might be looking at next. So we ran an experiment comparing our voice condition with just a GUI condition. And we wanted to see what the benefits were of having an agent speaking to you, but also for you to be able to speak to the agent. So looking at what the power of voice might be in helping these teams do this sense making and to be able to talk to each other. So we haven't built our agent yet. We're still in the process of doing that. So we used Wizard of Oz. And Wizard of Oz, as you can see here, is rather than having the intelligence in the system, we have a human being, which is this guy on the right, sitting in a room listening to the conversations and deciding as if he was the agent to interrupt or to make suggestions. So he will press buttons, which will then, our agent will start speaking to the team. So we ran this experiment where our system was set up so that participants, we had teams of 2, were able to ask Visi, our agent, questions, and they could do it in this voice condition or in what we're calling the touch condition. So to control the experiment, Visi provides suggestions in both conditions, so the same suggestions, but one is where it's speaking and the other is where it appears as text on the screen. And we asked 16 pairs to make sense of a series of data visualizations about obesity levels for the last 30 years. And the 3 variables they can explore in the data are for developing and developed countries, adults and children, and male and female. So this is where Visi initiates conversation when it thinks that they're stuck. So here's an example of Visi interrupting. Sorry about that, but you kind of just heard it. It's much better than that in the real study. This is the voice condition, just to recap. So users speak out voice commands to generate visualizations. So you would say, show women and men, or show children and adults. And then Visi can also say things like, why the difference between women and men are larger. So voice is being used in both ways. Both the participants are speaking and our system is speaking back. In the touch condition, which is just GUI, they select using a menu the options rather than speaking them, And the system you see on the right will respond or initiate by having text prompts. So that was the way in which we controlled our experiment. And here it is again. On the left, this is what they would speak, show global data or any of those variables. And then on the right, there are the menus by which they would select the options from. So, what did we find? Well, as in all good experiments, you hope to find a difference. And we did. In the voice condition, we found that the participants spoke more loudly to each other and more expressively. They had there was more intonation, they raised their voices, and they had more pitch to their voice. We also found that they thoroughly explored the data more. There was more in-depth discussion of the visualizations that they were looking at, and there was more identification of the trends. And they also spent more time looking at the visualizations. So something was happening about being able to speak and being spoken to as to how it changed the nature of the interaction in the teams. In the touch condition, the GUI, sometimes, as well as doing less of these, they missed patterns and trends which had been noticed in the voice. So these are the kinds of differences. I'm not going to go through these in any detail, but you can see we're calling one the VUI and the other the GUI, and we had significant statistical differences in terms of how they explored the data set and the commands that they made per minute. And so we have a whole number of these. My interns painstakingly did this type of analysis to show that changing the way in which you ask or you interact can have a significant effect on how you interrogate or explore the data. Sometimes, let's see if this time works. Fizzy interrupts when a pair gets stuck, just to show you how it would work.
If I would say one of them is slowing down in recent years, which one would you say it is?
So in there, they weren't saying anything, and so it then interrupted and asked them to think about something. But Fizzy is only human, and as you know in teams, sometimes someone speaks when they shouldn't, or you're saying something and they interrupt or they butt in, and that can interrupt the flow of the conversation. And this is only human, but here they were actually talking about the data when Fizzy butted in.
For whom would you say was the increase more steady throughout time? For women or for men?
Okay, so this is ongoing work. This is a Chi reject paper, but we had good scores, but everyone's familiar with that. And we were encouraged by our reviewers to revise this and to tighten up a few of our expressions and our discussions. So we will be doing that. But it was a good exercise for my PhD student who was working with me on this to learn about the Chi experience. What we're trying to do now is to think that was the Wizard of Oz experiment. We could do many more, but we'd like to actually build an agent that would be part of our system, that would be able to make interruptions or to be able to prompt. And so these are the kinds of things that we're looking at in our model of conversation. So as I say, we're looking at models of conversation rather than models of natural language processing as a way, because this is a constrained activity which is doing data analysis or making sense of data visualization. So we're not trying to do it for everything, we're trying to do it for a constrained setup. So we're looking at the turn-taking patterns that happen. If someone is dominating, maybe that's a good time to prompt. We're looking at speaker activity, which is part of that, how long someone's speaking for. We're looking at shared attention, so their head movements and their body movements as to whether they're paying attention together and how that might be modeled. And then looking at the speed and the extent to which they explore the database, and then the commands that are given. Is it by the participants or by Visi? And so thinking quite differently about how we're going to model conversations in order to have a more reactive agent. And this is by someone who's been working in this area, saying simple models of conversation can lead to surprisingly complex emergent outcomes. So that's that type of research. So just to sum up, I think the voice has something about it that is quite powerful in that it can command joint attention. It can help guide problem solving and sense making in certain directions. And as we saw from our initial study, it can encourage more discussion and turn taking. And it can be democratizing. Anyone can ask the virtual assistant a question. It's not just the person who's got the hold of the cursor or the mouse or the laptop. Okay, just for the last 5-10 minutes of my presentation, because I've only got 30 minutes, I'm going to talk about a different study that we did, which is looking about how voice assistants are being used in the home and how it's impacting on family life. And we, again, thinking about what research questions are important to ask. And firstly, does it have a positive impact, encouraging more social interactions, more routines and more emotional bonding? Or does it have a negative impact in that it impacts on social dynamics in the family, triggering, for example, sibling rivalry or preferential treatment amongst the children? So what we did was to think about what families did before they had one of these smart speakers. And many of you here are probably quite familiar with, I don't need to go through this, where you play games, you eat, you cook, you drink, you watch TV and so on, and you look at your mobile phone, you listen to music, you tease one another, you argue, you look at your mobile phone, and so on and so forth. And all of these are what these activities help towards making what it means to be a family, to bond and build social and emotional connections. So what we did was we looked, this was about a year ago now, we carried an in the wild study of Alexa where we gave 6 families an Alexa to use at home who hadn't had an Alexa before, and it was a 3-week-long study. And then we reanalyzed the conversations that took place. The families were told about this and they gave their consent. And we said it would just be our own use. And then the parents and children were interviewed at the beginning and at the end of the study. And as you can see from the participants, they were quite mixed families. And so we were interested in doing this in-depth analysis for different types of families. Alexa was set up with various skills, and these were intended to provide a diverse range of experiences. And an example skill that we set up was Pac-Man and the Ghastly Garbage. This is a family game that is meant to teach children and parents about the moral dilemmas of littering and trash, and particularly plastics and so on. And so this has been designed to make it a family game, and we were interested in how that was being used. But also, Alexa, there are many of these skills that you can download. We also got them to listen to music and riddles. So just to briefly summarize some of our key findings, what we found from this 3-week study, admittedly it was just a preliminary one, was that Alexa was used every day during meal times, cooking in and after school, and often together with largely positive interactions. So there was much family bonding during joint activities. Sometimes family members used Alexa to settle family disputes. So, for example here, we were discussing something and we didn't know who was right, so we asked Alexa. So you'd always ask Alexa to resolve them. And then younger children treated Alexa like a friend, a special friend, and they would ask questions like, Alexa, what's your second name? What's your third name? What's your fourth name? Alexa, do you like Siri? Is Siri your best friend? Does God exist? And so on and so forth. So it became the sort of, for 5-year-olds, it was just a perfect device by which to do all of that questioning. We analysed all of the conversations that took place and then classified them into 3 main types: family cohesion, family rituals, or scaffolding. And by family cohesion, these were things like shared laughter, teasing, exchanging looks when using it, and family rivalry. And as you can see, there were quite a lot of these over the 3-week study. I'll just go through these briefly. Family cohesion, examples were when Alexa misunderstood what was being said. And here's where, when Mum asked how long to cook sausages for, Alexa thought she wanted to order sausages. And so Alexa can make mistakes, and the family can just sort of laugh together at the expense of Alexa. They can exchange gestures. For example, Alexa loves telling facts. This is one fact it was telling them. In the 18th century, it was believed that kissing a donkey could relieve toothache. And they would show disgusted faces as if, behind Alexa's face. Family Rivalry was another one, when one sibling interrupted Alexa to play their music, causing the other to get upset. So that's quite common, apparently, is to, you want your music, you don't want your sister's or your brother's music to play. It was like one of us would put music on and the other would change it when they couldn't put up with it anymore, so we were not taking turns. Family rituals was a big thing, particularly during Christmas time, where they created new ones. So if there was a song, at the time of the study, it was Baby Shark. I'm not going to play it. And they all learnt the dance to Baby Shark. And so this would come on every morning and in the evening, and all the family members would join in and dance together, and providing that opportunity to bond. Then scaffolding was another thing that we found, was that Alexa doesn't understand young children, particularly those who are 2 or 3 years old, because the way they talk is still in baby talk. And what we found was that older members of the family often helped out. They said commands slowly and loudly for the child to repeat. And so the children learned through this scaffolding how to speak to Alexa and know to say Alexa first rather than stop Alexa. So there was many examples of this type of scaffolding helping children to work out how to interact with it. So just to summarize, our findings showed that Alexa readily became a new voice in the family and a member of the family, and the mostly positive interactions took place, but there were some negative when siblings were, squabbling or fighting, they would use Alexa sometimes. It encouraged new family routines and rituals to develop, and children were inducted into a range of conversational skills. For example, how to hold the floor, how to take turns. Even though it was frustrating for younger children to use, because they weren't understood, their siblings and parents would help them to learn how to interact properly. So finally, I just would like you to think about, given the success and the rising trend of these devices in the home and hopefully in the workplace, what will happen to family life and also business life or at work when these voice assistants become truly smart? They're pretty dumb at the moment, but as we develop machine learning and algorithms and we develop new models of conversation and we implement these, what's going to happen? Will they become truly conversational partners? Will children learn to have conversations with their smart speakers before they do with their parents or their siblings? And if so, will the imaginary friend disappear? I think all of these raises new moral questions. So whilst they'll still be seen as devices, their uses, especially young children, might begin to imbue them with psychological traits. They might think that this smart speaker has actual emotions and it has actual personality. It might be capable of thought, an evil thought. It might be able to tell them off. It might be able to become their best friend. And if all of these things are possible, how is that going to affect children's development? Are they going to develop differently as they learn to interact with these smart agents? Should they or will they take over more of a parental role? For example, they could nag and tell the children off. They could tell them to clean their teeth, eat with their mouth shut, stop pulling each other's hair, do their homework, go to bed, and so on. They could equally praise them and reward them, and they can tell them off. So they could give them, say well done, high fives, and so on. So the shift in responsibility from parents to these smart speakers could be quite subtle, but it could grow as parents realize they don't have to shout at their kids anymore. They can get these devices. The big question is whether the kids will take any notice. Maybe the young ones will, but not the older ones. So I think I'm at the end of my time now, and I think Jodi's all chomping at the bit down there to have another Beyond. But I just want to conclude by saying that graphical user interfaces are clearly here to stay. They're not going anywhere. And this kind of clicking, dragging, and dropping is something that's so fundamental to many of our interactions that it seems foolish to even think that we would do away with it, because it's a very efficient, very natural, and fast interaction. But I think, as I've shown you, or hopefully discussed today, is that voice user interfaces are finding new niches, and that is not just in the home, but also in the workplace. So far, it's been mainly command, listen, and respond interactions. But I think there's much more potential for doing other things like augmenting cognitive interactions, and I hope I've shown you that with the sense-making and decision-making, and also social interactions and new kinds of social bonding. And in the future, they definitely will become more proactive and more conversational. And that's where HCI needs to develop new user models and metaphors, and also consider whether they should be supporting us, scaffolding us, suggesting to us, intervening, being prompting or other. And I would like to finally just finish by saying for truly intelligent user interfaces, I think we need to be combining not just graphical user interfaces with voice user interfaces, but also thinking about how we can bring AI into the mix. And it should be that way round rather than how HCI can be used by AI. And I think at that point, I'll just like to say thank you. We're leaving questions to the end when we have a discussion.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. Now for something completely different. So as Nuno said, I'm at the HCI Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. I'm trained in design, but I work in a computer science school. And for the past 2 years, I've actually been the leader of the HCII. So it's an interesting way to use my design skills to actually design an organization filled with very intelligent people. And I've spent the bulk of my career doing design research, making a case for why it's important, and why it's important in the face of technologies that are growing around AI and other things. And I do a lot of work in service design, design for healthcare, human-robot interaction, and educational games, really looking at how design can play a role in shaping these technologies so they're appropriate for people. But today I want to give a talk that's a little bit more speculative and talk about design and where I think it's going. And I want to start by reflecting a story that I heard recently at a conference. This was a service design conference, and a designer got up and said that he had solved the problem of bringing fresh drinking water to the world. And I thought that was really interesting because, first of all, it's a huge problem. And second of all, there would be a number of ways to solve it. But it's true, designers are now working in education and public policy and healthcare and a lot of really difficult domains. And at the same time, I've been writing a book about the changes in our discipline and really thinking about what is the discipline of design doing? Our scope is increasing. What do we teach people? Or as my mentor, Harold Nelson says, what the hell is design? How can we have an impact in a world that continuously changes? And so I want to set the context a little bit for design today by recognizing that first, our world is really changing. And in the past decade, we've seen the rise of many dire societal problems, such as the global aging of our population, or in the US, the opioid crisis, or the gun crisis, or in the world, climate change due to increasing amounts of greenhouse gases. And so society is fractioning as people are failing to heed the signs of these problems or the needs of current and future generations. And these problems are what Herbert Simon called wicked problems, or Russell Ackoff deemed messes. Like the problem of fresh drinking water, they're very complex and there's a number of ways to look at them and solve them. The world is also witnessing the emergence of a new economic reality. So in the US, the economy has continued to grow steadily, but the indicators of the health of the economy are problematic. And so this recent graphic from the New York Times article shows how per capita income and employment rates and GDP can look positive, but actually they're quite negative. There are going to be some problems. Also, international trade and production has changed how we produce things. So in the 1950s, nearly all the cars on the road in the United States were made by American companies. But today, the most popular car in the US is actually the Toyota Camry. Now, components of cars are made everywhere in the world and manufactured everywhere in the world. So we have global blurring of manufacture and production of all car models, both American and foreign. So today, many companies are blurring their boundaries and producing and developing things globally. We're also seeing a rise from a focus in manufacture to a focus in service delivery. This graphic from the New York Times shows how in the US and actually worldwide, I think the US was late to the game, that the rise of services now lead the most profitable companies in the US. So around 1960, on the left-hand side, you can see that the largest, most profitable companies in the US were goods-producing companies, companies like GM and ITT and Esso. But then around about 2010, we saw a sea change, and the largest, most profitable companies became service delivery companies, companies like Walmart, IBM, and McDonald's. So this production of consumer goods is on the decline. The production of services targeted to particular purposes is on the rise. And many of these services rely on systems of products and smart products that are informed by data streams. And so this is another complex thing that we haven't really designed for before. And at the same time, we're seeing a sea change in technology, from the personal computer to the invention of the internet, from cloud computing to smartphones, from the invention of continuous sensing to wearable computing, and from 3D printing to augmented and virtual reality. Technology continues to evolve at a rapid pace, changing the material of what we design with. And people have benefited greatly from access to these kinds of technologies. So for example, email, blogs, and online document services speeded communication, but we can ask, has that been good entirely? Ride-sharing services have enabled mobility, meaning that people can get around in ways that they have never done before. A revolution is taking place in healthcare as people now have access to their data, and this can change what people can do or how they can be treated. And then, of course, education is changing with the advent of online learning, enabling greater access to education for everyone. And sadly, I think we're at a really incivil moment in society. We have many really conservative governments, many polarized groups, and there seems to be more and more demeaning and aggressive behavior in society. And so research on the topic of incivility has found that this act of incivility affects our mental and physical health, our worker productivity, our employee retention, and that when we have negative behavior, it's actually magnified by social contagion. And so this is a really disarming trend in the world, and I think it's something that we also need to think about. So more recently, the rapid proliferation of sensing technology has led to stores of data available, and design and HCI needs to think about what to do with it. Machine learning and AI act on this data to make products that are smart, and some say that the advances here are really about data, not about artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence has been around for a while. So when we see smart products, we see commodities like Barbie that now have smartness. Actually, Mattel purchased an AI company to create this doll that could have conversations and remember things about the children that played with her. So design thinking is an approach that's been used to innovate solutions to these kinds of problems and to respond to these changes in society. And a quick search of the internet shows many definitions for design thinking, including a process for creative problem solving, a design methodology that provides a solution-based approach to solving problems, and applying the principles of design to the way people work. So design thinking has some historic precedents, and I wanted to touch on each of these because they reflect social, economic, and technological contexts of the time that they were developed in. So as design changed, so did how people conceptualized and worked with design. So Raymond Loewy in the 1940s formulated his Maya principle, most advanced yet acceptable. This expressed the idea that product designs are bounded by functional constraints of math and materials and logic, but that the acceptance of these things is constrained by social expectations. Christopher Alexander's timeless way of building described the perfection of use to which buildings could aspire. It talked about how architects could make great buildings or great towns, beautiful places, and what was really important was to make people feel comfortable, to make them feel themselves, to make them feel alive when they experienced these spaces. And then another one that I wanted to talk about was the movement of participatory design and Project Utopia in the 80s. And this project was about involving workers to empower them when technology was brought into their workplace. This was around the introduction of early desktop layout technology in a newspaper office, and when editors began to tell typesetters that they had to use this technology and their jobs would fundamentally change or be made redundant. So Project Utopia relied on cooperation between workers and technologists, experienced design methods, and lots of lo-fi prototype with things as simple as paper and cardboard to ascertain that these workers would have an improved future state around this technology. So in all these examples, we see this concern for the social, concern for the individual, and concern for collaboration between stakeholders in a project. So returning to design thinking, in 2008, IDEO's Tim Brown published a highly influential article on design thinking in the Harvard Business Review, as well as a popular industry book called Change by Design. Brown described design thinking as a methodology that imbues the full spectrum of innovation activities with a human-centered design ethos. By this, he continued, I mean that innovation is possible through a thorough understanding, through direct observation of what people want and need in their lives. He also represented design thinking as a cycle of inspiration, ideation, and implementation, made up of sub-cycles involving explorations of the design space, framework development, prototyping, evaluation, and dissemination of knowledge through the case to the rest of the business world. He defined 5 personality qualities of people who did design thinking, including empathy, integrative thinking, optimism, experimentation, and collaboration. For the next decade or so, and continuing up until today, I would argue, design thinking was subsequently misunderstood and hyped. So if you go online and you search on design thinking, you can find hundreds of blog posts like this one, which really don't like design thinking at all. Some of them are not nice at all, and I cut out the obscene ones from my talk today, but they go on and on and on. And 10 years later, there's still much debate about design thinking and its dissemination. Here's an HBR article from last year written by a professor of public policy at NYU who said, the criticisms are several. Design thinking is poorly defined. The case for its use relies on anecdotes more than data, and that it's little more than basic communication. She went on to say, design thinking privileges the designer above the people she serves, and in doing so, limits participation in the design process. It limits the scope for truly innovative ideas, making it hard to solve challenges that are characterized by a high degree of uncertainty. And then she went on to say, design thinking bears an uncanny resemblance to an earlier model of problem solving celebrated in the 1970s and 80s for the superior solutions it was supposed to produce. Called the rational experimental approach to design, problem solving, it was a simplified and popularized version of a scientific method. So this author, who is a public policy person, didn't seem to be aware of the design methods movement or the notion that design thinking is applied to what we call wicked problems. Nor had she thought of the development of design thinking as a way to articulate design research as a way that's impactful in organizations throughout the world, not just design, but businesses, governments, and so on. So in my view, bringing design thinking to the world was one of the greatest things that Brown and IDEO did in the 2000s. It did for design, it did highlight that design was substantive, was accessible, could be persuasive, and it created a rabid desire for design thinking among a lot of different disciplines and audiences, much like Don Norman did for design in his own way. So it was really wonderful, I think, and how it did service to the design community. As I say, no press is bad press. So the benefits of design thinking, I think, offer a process for inventing a better world than we have now, a means for fostering a disciplined imagination that can be used to invent new products and services that are desirable, technically feasible, economically viable, and that realize a vision of a preferred future state. So implicit in this idea is that we understand people and social, economic, and technological factors that surround them. We imagine many possible futures through what we do, and we make many things to understand which imagined future might be optimal. And so while design thinking has been great and has pushed the boundaries of what we do, I'm still thinking back to that conference where the designer talked about solving the drinking water problem. And the question nags at me, do we need something more than design thinking? Or what comes after design thinking? And so what I think we need is a thoughtful engagement with design practice as it fits in the world today, taking into account history, subdisciplines, industry, academia, and the world today alike. So what do we need to learn to become designers in an increasingly complex and volatile era? I'm evolving this notion of design leadership to answer these questions and to evolve design thinking. So a lot of design leaders have begun to argue that we actually need further design scholarship in today's society, and I'm intrigued with what that could look like. So one of my favorite examples of what I would call design leadership that led to radical change is a paper from 2007 about accidental change at a Baptist church in the US. The title of the paper is Radical Change Accidentally, the Emergence and Amplification of Small Change. I think is a beautiful example of design leadership. So the case was a white Baptist church that sat in a largely black community. There was a lot of hostility between the members of the church and the community that lived nearby, and the church's gates and doors were closed to residents of the community. Then a simple decision to offer breakfast to homeless people in the community on the weekends led to radical change in the church and its surrounding environment. Subsequently, the doors of the church and the gates to the church were unlocked. The security system was dismantled. The church offices were moved from the front of the building to the back so that when somebody came in off the street, they could be seen and greeted. Volunteer numbers grew. Parishioners began to offer services like free medical and dental checkups for the community. And the membership of the church became more diverse. The iconography around the church changed as signage was put down and new signs were put up. Offensive signage that was racial in nature was melded, made into a chalice, and carried to a neighboring black church. And the church was ultimately declared a safe zone for the homeless in the community. So theories of radical change were unable to explain why this change occurred. The authors believe that because the change was unintended, emergent, and slow, that it occurred in destabilizing conditions, and that it was followed by subsequent actions, some very small. It thereby resulted in radical change. So I like this case because the conditions around it neatly mirror the world that we live in. It's a microcosm of what the world has become today. Destabilizing context sets the stage for the possibility of change. A high degree of tension means that the connections between people and parts of the system tighten, and amplifying small changes like free breakfast becomes easy. A lack of equilibrium means that emergent self-organization is likely to occur as people identify problems that they think they can positively impact. And in this context, novel changes are often more accepted, and they result in larger change. Continuous change, or the dynamic interaction of contextual conditions, small change, and amplification, result in a pattern of change that is radical and continuous. So I'm interested in figuring out how we can train designers to enact radical change in today's world. I've seen a pattern of students wanting to do this as they look for bigger and bigger problems of interest. What skills do we need to train students to do things like identifying problematic situations? This suggests that we don't simply hand out problems, that we train designers to have judgments in playing a role in figuring out what to improve. That we become conversant in ethics. Much as we saw in Yvonne's talk, we need to understand how we design and what we teach, especially in the face of abundant data and these autonomous things that act on our behalf. We need to position ourselves as designers to do societal good. We need to think about the application of our work, but also what happens when it fails or takes an unintended turn. We need to teach designers to have a career, not a vocation. We need to train designers for a long life of work, not just the first job that they get out of school, because the field is dynamic and the jobs will change. And we need to consider what I call design as leadership, to look at design as an action of change, a social and collaborative process, moving from the current state, moving towards consensus and towards an improved future state. So I think we need 3 skills to get there. So I'm proposing this 3-part framework. The first is empathy, to develop a way of seeing. The second is communication, to develop a way of abstracting. And the third is problem reframing, to build our design judgments and figure out what problems we deem important and to lift up. So the first part of the design leadership framework is empathy. This is basically seeing a solution from many viewpoints. And there's 2 notions here. The first is connoting an understanding of others. And Checkland, who's a systems theorist, talked about soft systems and putting designers in the system. That means that we need to understand and live the solutions we're designing for. In early HCI, this was phrased in my department as the user is not like me. Now, with data-driven systems and platforms, there's many users. There's many people that are affected by a design, and we need to think about it in this way. And the second notion I would talk about is serving. And this is different than helping or fixing. Helping connotes that the helper is of a higher status than the person they're helping. And fixing connotes that something is broken. So I like this notion of service, which the author Remen talks about, where we look at value sharing, everybody being on the same level and looking at a system holistically. The second part of the design leadership framework is communication, and I think of communication as artifacts that designers use to make the future tangible for multiple stakeholders. So this includes ideas, sketches, prototypes, pitches, but also seeking patterns, commonalities, and techniques that shape the possibilities of communication. So for example, some of the work we're doing now is looking at how designers can innovate with artificial intelligence. We're using it all the time. We have corrective email, we have predictive calendars, but designers struggle to innovate with this material. So if we could use design patterns or taxonomies, we might help designers to begin to reason how to work with this material. So some research has offered the idea that the relationship between communication and interaction, which is a central problem for communication theory, is also a central problem for design. And then the third part of the design leadership framework is problem reframing. And this is reframing a problem in new and interesting ways. So I exist in a department where there's a lot of scientific research and where much of my career has tried to make a case for why design research is important but different than scientific research. And this reframing, this idea of pivoting, I think is a key characteristic of design research. And so if you want to learn about it, Dorst has written about this in a very elegant way. And one way that we've learned how to do this is by using abstraction or conceptual models. These are really great tools that we teach our designers and HCI students, and they come back and tell us how useful they are in research and practice. We can also use frames like metaphors, analogies, and conjectures. So to recap, there's 3 ideas here within this design as leadership framework. There's building empathy by developing a way of seeing. There's building communication by developing a way of abstracting, and there's problem reframing to build design judgments and to figure out what we should lift up and deem important to work on. So being a designer starts right after the decision is made to become a designer. I do believe that anybody can adopt these principles in their thinking and work. We're working with larger boundaries. We're working with more complex problems, but still this frame of design is really important. So I believe that design leadership should be a part of any designer's life. And I think we need more work on what design and design education should be. So in my work, I want to improve the very nature of design itself. And so I've tried to introduce these ideas of design leadership, which I think we need so badly in the work, and in the world, and to make design more systemic, holistic, and ethical and purposeful in order to match the challenges and expectations of today. So thank you for listening to my speculative talk. It's quite a different kind of talk, but I wanted to share it with you.
Well, this was just fantastic, and I think now I know why I'm here, because I'm not a designer, psychologist, I'm an engineer. So I like to build things, and by building, there's this issue about designing, about testing, about thinking. And it's interesting to see these two talks, because I was trying to see how, well, they are commonalities, but they're different approaches. And I think this question of the process, the building, the creating some new technologies, services, and societies is what we're trying to discuss here. So I just wanted to ask both of you about this idea of creating these new technology and societies, and actually what I want to ask you is, I think a lot of it has to do with emotions. And I wanted you to think about this process and the role of emotions in this process, both of you. Okay, so expecting.
That? Oh, there we go. I wasn't expecting that question to begin with. Emotion is very popular. Affective computing is, all my students love to do the course we offer in affective computing because they're fascinated by emotions. And so I think there is something about, current research is very interested in how we might understand better what emotions are. I mean, in the past, emotions tended to be based on very basic fundamental models. Maybe we had 6 emotions: anger, happiness, sadness, and really quite, sort of abrupt. Whereas I think now we can develop technologies that can perhaps understand what emotions are at a more nuanced level. And so in my research, I don't focus on emotion directly, but I'm interested in how technologies can impact on emotional well-being. And as you saw in my talk, very much about the sort of emotional bonding that takes place in families and how you can facilitate that, but also you can, make people angry or upset through these technologies. And so to understand how they can both produce positive emotions, but also negative, and that we can't necessarily be in control all the time of changing people's emotions. And just to finish off, I remember Don Norman many years ago coming up with a model of emotional technology and arguing that we should try and keep people happy at work because they focus more and they're more creative. And I think, if I'm allowed to say, because he's not in the audience, that that is quite a simplistic model of what we think of emotions and why we're interested in them. And I think we need much more nuanced models and understanding if we are to start to try and intervene or to try and improve people's well-being.
I think in the case of Alexa and in the case of the speakers is indeed, actually, I think emotions play a big role because as groups interact and so on, the having another entity there, it can really impact and grabs attention, and emotion is very much related with that. And it's also related with the process of creating.
Sure, when HCI moved off the desktop, designers realized that they needed to think about the people and the context of use. So I think that was the first interest in emotion. And now I think it is ultimately more important as we design these data-driven things that people are interacting with for long periods of time and systems that act autonomously on our behalf. So we really need to understand how they situate with people's emotions and values.
Okay, I think the other thing that came across in your talks in both the design thinking and the interfaces, the new kind of conversational agents actually, is to do with this notion of being in the physical world and changing and making a difference in the physical world, and that's related with embodiment. And a few months ago, I was having this big conversation, and people started arguing that speech is embodied. And as soon as someone speaks, it becomes part of your physical world, and therefore this grabbing of attention and so on is extremely important. So I was wondering whether the fact that you have the Alexa there, the physical, or is the speech there? Or, for example, if you have a Jibu, a character that moves around, it's more the speech, or this relation with embodiment, I think it's interesting.
Again, embodiment has become very fascinating for research as we develop new theories, because we can, try and measure it or try and understand it through observing how people are animated or how they engage in the physical world when they're talking with others. And so I think that in itself, that science is developing, which will help us, because I think when I was interested in embodiment, we sort of referred to Lakoff's metaphors we live by, which was from the 80s, thinking about how our physical interactions in the world result in our ability to think at an abstract level. And that is, that was very much how the research was done. But now I think we are developing different kinds of theories of what embodiment means. And that will be important in terms of how we think about designing these more intelligent interfaces. So should they just be things that are embodied in our phones, or should they have a physical presence, because that will engage people more? And certainly we've seen that the form factor of robots has a profound effect on how people interact, particularly children and adults. Sometimes they would prefer to have them as appearing abstract or as pets rather than looking like humans, because they feel more comfortable, they can interact with them, and they know where they are. If we design robots to be more look like ourselves, I think that can be unnerving, make people feel uncomfortable. In my talk, I was considering not how they look, but how they behave and how they appear to us. Are they appearing like humans? And that again is some kind of embodiment. So I think in the future it would be good to have better models, just like of emotion, and how we exhibit embodiment and how we exhibit emotions through technology, but also through other beings and in the physical world. So I think the science of embodiment is, oh, you're buzzing. There we go, she's being embodied. Is in its infancy, and I think that in the next few years we'll see new theories being developed. At least I hope so.
Yeah, some of our research right now is trying to answer questions such as, well, we are in a near future of robots and agents, and these things could move from embodiment to embodiment. So what design features and what elements of context should be known and retained? So if I go to Anna's house and use her Alexa, is it my Alexa? Is my information left behind? If I go to the doctor's office and they access my personal agent, should it know my health information? And what we're seeing so far is that people rely on human frames to make sense of this technology. It's really not surprising. They're worried about things like the cognitive limitations of an agent or this for HCI, and I think we need a lot of study there.
But do you think that is what's the future, or where's the future? Actually, there's a thing that I really liked in the way you frame the need for the design. And I was thinking about also aspects associated with morality, because you say, well, the leadership, the design leadership is to do with you need empathy and you need let me see, I wrote it. Anyway, empathy, communication, problem, rephrasing, but it's also to do with morality, because we are designing to change the society, and issues associated with how we design, how do we put values into the technology that we build, also needs to be thought. I don't know. Do you want to? Okay. Yeah, come on.
Oh, yeah, I think all of those things are important, and I think the field of design has been looking to describe itself ethically for many decades, and somehow we never seem to get there. It continues to be more complex. But truly a concern for human values has been a core of design for many, many years, many decades.
I'm going to ask a question before we go to the audience. Just a quick question, because we had two very interesting talks here. One talking about the expansion of the design space in terms of the technological possibilities, and another one from Jodi trying to explain to us how design could be brought to a different level and actually be used to solve world problems. And my question was to both of you, what is the impact of these two visions in terms of how we teach the new generation of students? Because it seems that we need to teach students to use many different technologies, and we cannot stop teaching the previous ones because they are also very important, like you were saying, Yvonne. And the other one is that we need to teach students to do interaction design, and then service design, and then design strategy. And how can we put all of these things together in a curriculum?
That's a great question, and each year I face that dilemma for my own students, and we could perhaps offer undergraduate courses rather than just graduate courses, but I often think that students probably know about GUI interfaces, so I cut back things on menu design, icon design, which I might have spent more time on, and instead get them to think about how do they design a chatbot, how do they design a voice interface, how would they do an in-the-wild study, and so on. And so it is how much can you learn? And I think that it's not just human-computer interaction, but it's any field. So architecture, for example, they need to learn about how you can put sensors into buildings and how, to take into account sustainability and so on and so forth. There are many more things, and I think this isn't just architecture, it could be sociology, it can be medicine, an enormous amount of things. And each of these are also confronted with ethics. And I think it's a really difficult one because we don't really know. We haven't taught ethics other than in philosophy. And there are very few people I know who working in HCI who have something new to say about ethics other than we must do this, we should be fair, we should be transparent. And I think I'm constantly, thinking and worrying about how do we actually, teach ethics to our students so that they understand it. So the questions I put at the end of my talk was, should we be designing intelligent agents and robots who we can hand over the responsibility of telling our children off, telling our children how to grow up? And should we be doing that? Or should we, take it, it should always be a human being who tells them what to do. But it will be possible. So there's a moral dilemma, and I don't know the answer. And do you know the answer? What do you think? Do you think that we should just keep our agents to be dumb, because then we don't have this moral dilemma? Or do we face this moral dilemma head on and decide? But then we become too prescriptive and too religious about, we say you must do this or you must do that. And so I think like the wicked problems that Jodi mentioned, that we've been talking about, moral problems will be wicked in their own sense. And I think that's, how do we manage that is for us. So I've probably gone off a bit, but I think we need to teach about morals and about dilemmas and about wicked problems as much as we need to teach about how to use wireframes.
I guess I will deepen that by saying I get around to a lot of institutions that teach or have design as part of their curriculum, and I'm worried about the future because there's barely an understanding of the technologies that are changing our world, and we are the group that can have impact on creating a future state that's helpful, or helping to do that. So I do think we need to have a mechanism to allow designers to understand technology and be facile with it, so they can have a seat at the table with technologists, because data scientists aren't making innovative products, designers are, and we need to work together to meld them so we have expert technology and the right thing for people at the same time. So I think right now I have more questions than answers about it.
So I think now we can go to the audience. Okay.
Sylvia and Mariana are helping out with the microphone.
Thanks. Okay, thank you very much for the talk. My name is Anas Hossaria, and I'm very much into design thinking. For the last years, I've been working in the topic. So if you allow me ask 2 questions, please, I hope the audience will know. So first one is, whenever I'm teaching people about design thinking, I always show them the other, like that it's not the only source of truth, because I want them to open their mind for other ways as well. So it's exactly that point when some businesses succeed, when they tell you, like, people don't know what they want until we show it to them. We create the demand. So we don't need to go and empathize. No, we just create the demand. And in business school, sometimes they teach them that, and it works. That's the first question. What are your thoughts about that? And the second one is regarding the process itself. Where do you think we can, in the process, improve? Is there a place where we can tweak something, do some improvement? And the sub-bullet question here is, for that one, is I sometimes tell people, don't be so strict with it, keep it loose, see what applies for your case, and go ahead. I'm really eager to hear your thoughts about that. Thanks a lot, sir.
So second question first, I think that we can approach what design thinking is as a mindset. It's not prescriptive like cooking a recipe. It's descriptive like giving pointers to help you make a better tennis serve. Sorry, can you repeat the first question?
So the first question was about when somebody tells you people don't know what they want until we show it to them. What are your thoughts? How would you respond to that?
Well, I'm sure Yvonne is going to deepen this, but people never know what they want, and they say what they say and think is very different than what they believe. So I think there is some skill and strategy to getting at that.
this is when I would say not going beyond user-centered design. I still think user-centered design has a lot to offer us to thinking about what should we be designing, and we can be very creative and then get feedback and do that kind of iterative design. So I'm stepping back from going beyond at this point because I still think there's a lot to be said for that. But I do think it is a mindset, as Jodi was talking about. How do you get students to, to step into other people's shoes, into different stakeholders, to imagine what it feels like to be something? And that is, I think, part of user-centered design. And I think design thinking can be broadened out. One of the problems we have in our field are that there are many different approaches and philosophies about what's the best way to do design. And someone might think that participatory design is better than co-design, that's better than action through research, and so on. And so we have these kinds of factions, whereas I think they actually overlap a lot. And it's very much down to you deciding yourself what's the best way you found for teaching students to be able to experience empathy, to do problem solving, to understand what wicked problems are, and to be able to work through a wicked problem. One size doesn't fit all. So, what you use might be quite different from what I use and what Jodi proposes. And at the end of the day, it's very much getting people to decide what they're comfortable with in order to come up with innovative, useful technologies that will help save the planet.
Thank you.
There's one there.
My mother is calling. Hi, thank you for the talk.
I will just.
Yes? Okay. Thank you for the talk. My question is about more the Alexa study case. If we think that the search engines are some kind of predecessors of voice assistants, right? We've seen the news about how search engines, social networks, and websites like YouTube has been used to suggest content based on advertisement, based on political views, based on conspiracy theories. So how can we trust these new technologies if the predecessors have still those ethical issues? Because it's not an offline device, right? It's an online. And I remember that there was this doll in Germany, and they have to remove from the market because the doll had some vulnerability that allowed to expose conversations. And so I'd like to know, how can we make how can we make devices trustworthy instead of make people trust them?
That's a very good question, and one that we're always up against as we come up with a new technology. This is where I think it's good for HCI people to be working with people in cybersecurity and really thinking about how can they make these technologies, these devices, Internet of Things, much more secure. And so that it's much harder to hack into them. So I think it's not necessarily down to the designers trying to solve this, but to try and be up there with the people who are experts at thinking about how do you make data secure, how do you encrypt it, how do you ensure that these devices don't get hacked into readily. I mean, one of the biggest scares is once we get automated cars, someone can hack into it and drive you to places you may not want, or drive you off the road, and so on. So it's a real problem. And I think, as I said, that it needs us to be working hand in hand with people in cybersecurity. I also think that we need to, be thinking of how do you make people feel reassured about where their data is going. And so many of these companies like Google and Facebook are now trying to write their terms and conditions and their privacy policies in a way that people understand, so that they feel comfortable knowing where their data is going, what it's being used for. And is it just going to be put into the cloud? Is it going to be anonymized? So I think it's largely also down to education and awareness and down to security. I think it's it's also down to different cultures. So in Germany, they're much more worried than in other cultures about where their data goes, and privacy is much more important to them than, say, in China. So that we'll get differences as to what's acceptable about these devices, as well as to what people care about where their data goes, who's using it. So I think these are all really pertinent questions that you need to be thinking about. How do you make data safe? How do people feel comfortable what their data is being used for? And these devices, provide that data.
Hi, my name is Inês Rodolfo. I'm a researcher in digital health and well-being. Thank you so much for your talks. So we have these big players. We have the US. This is how I see the debate. We have the US like a big producer of technology, and we have and implementing technology in the world, and we have Europe concerned with regulating ethics in technology. So that's how I see the debate. And my question is both for ethics regulation and both for technology implementation in the world. So the thing is, regarding AI will have a huge impact in assistive technology in order to promote human well-being. So we are all concerned right now for enhancing the human well-being. So in human-machine interaction, which emotions should machines have access to in order to support humans? Should machines have access to all emotions? Thank you.
Well, first of all, I want to deepen your Europe-US distinction by calling to mind China.
Yeah,
with the social score. That's a
China
big piece that we want to think about because it's super predictive analytics.
China as well.
So I'm going to say, in the interest of science and hopefully doing what's right, machines should understand all emotions. Yeah.
I'm not sure what you mean by which emotions. I mean, do you mean that they should have access to some or none? Or, I mean, there's software that's out there that does emotion recognition by how your face moves, the muscles. It'll decide whether you're happy, whether you're angry, and there's a company called Affectiva, and they have millions and millions of images now that have been taken naturally of people looking at ads, people looking at films, people driving, because they have the cameras there, and they're using these and doing some training on that data to work out whether, when you look in a particular way, what emotional state you're in. And this is then used to decide which ads or which film ending to give you. In the car, it might be used to decide whether you are really angry and you should stop driving because you're a risk to other drivers. And but the models that have been developed are really simple. It's like, whilst the emotion recognition software is very sophisticated, the models of what to do with this are quite simple. So if someone's appearing angry, do you then suggest to them, I'm going to play you some gentle music because you appear angry, which would be quite patronizing and probably make people even more angry. So I think what we as HCI people have to do is to take this sophisticated AI technology that can detect our emotions and to then think, well, what do we do with this? Do we, suggest behaviors? So in well-being, do you suggest, you look a bit down at the moment, why don't you go for a run? Or you look really happy, why don't you go and talk to your grandma who seems a bit sad at the moment? We don't have any models as to what's best to do with this data. So I think that's something for us to be thinking about, is what do we as HCI researchers or psychologists decide what to do with all of this data that's been collected, and we're able now to classify emotions not just in these 6 but maybe 20 different emotions, and then we can also model emotion so that we can see that after you've been happy for 10 minutes, you then get really down there, and then you might come back up here. What do we do with that data? I don't know, and I'm throwing it back to you. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that regarding face recognition that has been here for a while, I relate that more to machine learning, not much as for AI. So I think AI will make a breakthrough to a next level that we are not aware yet of regarding the outcomes and the impact. We are trying to figure out, and we debate about it. So the thing with emotions in AI, I think it will be different with machine learning. In AI, if the machine has access to, if the machine feels anger, it may destroy humanity. Sorry for this, this scenario. It's not like Blade Runner or something, but it's like sort of just a thought that's why the question if machines should access the emotions, all of them, yeah.
It's a very important question, and one which many people are worried about. When machines become more intelligent and they become emotional, how do they act and react? But coupled with that is we anthropomorphize machines, and as they become more intelligent, we think that they have more intelligence and more emotions than they actually have. So that could make it even harder, more complicated and more dangerous.
Okay, I think we are running out of time, but we still have one last question if there is anyone. Doesn't seem so. So then I will take this opportunity to thank our guests and Anna Paiva also for sharing this panel. Thank you very much. And also Sylvia and Marianne, who did the amazing work of organizing all of this.
And thank you, Nunu.